Good morning. Oh, wait a minute. I came 2 time zones away. Good morning. Okay, give me energy. Hello and welcome. Hey, y'all. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. So I had to put the y'all in there. I'm excited to be here. And I know we have some folks in the room from Nashville as well as online. Woo, woo. And I want to call out one of my favorite grant professionals, Dr. Bernard Turner. So, see, yours too, right? So it's always important for me to physically ground myself in the place where I am speaking. So in particular, I want to begin our time together with an acknowledgement of the people of this land. In my research of the city, I came across the Seattle Municipal Archives, where it shares that this city is built on indigenous land, the traditional territory of Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Suquamish and Duwamish tribes. They lived in the region for thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans or white settlers and developed extensive trade and social networks, along with a deep knowledge of the land and sea, and continue to live here today. I wish to specifically call to your attention that though there is a public acknowledgement on the city's website that does not reduce or erase any harm or systemic injustices of the past, the present, or the future, I also recognize that because I'm not familiar with Seattle and its indigenous communities, that does not expunge me from learning. My lack of awareness of each tribe who has contributed to the city, the state, and the country does not diminish the contributions we should all be grateful for. It is my intention and my action to continue to seek and share the truth. Though an acknowledgement is never enough, it is my hope that it brings awareness to each of you to learn more about the land in which you are positioned on, and encourage those of you within power and authority to make your own public acknowledgements in your community and repair any harm. You can, of course, learn more about how to find those tribes at native-land.ca or by communicating with your local tribal leadership. Okay, so that's kind of my formal acknowledgement. The other piece about this is I didn't bring any people with me. So usually I bring like some folks and, you know, they take cute photos and we do social, see? Right, we gotta make sure that I've got right, you know. So if you do that, if I say something brilliant, I'm sure I will, please tag me on social media at Kia Jarmon. My name was up there, but it should be in your book and online. You can find me any platform, share those things, but get my good side, okay? So I've already been formally introduced, but let me set the stage for what we're gonna accomplish in our time together. In my professional work, I have spent almost 20 years as a communications and community engagement professional, a collective impact and capacity building consultant, and a civic leader. I teach countless workshops each month. I champion philanthropy, have on my philanthropy shirt. I lead hard conversations, but my most important job is that of a mom to a 7-year-old. And in all of those experiences, maybe being a mom being the one that taught me the best, I realized that though my skills are of a solutionist, I can solve almost any problem. Bring me anything and I can solve it. Yes, I know that's ego, but it's also fact. 2 truths can be in the same sentence. It is my primary job to help leaders navigate through their own change. I've spent all of these years being the answer, showing up and providing the solutions, controlling all the nuances, standing in all the gaps. And then I realized I was doing a disservice because just like when you're in school, when the order of operations or experiences are different than what I presented you with, you're totally lost. But if I teach you how to think critically and ask questions, then we have a different relationship with the experience. Now you can solve your own problems. So take all your notes. Remember, I'm gonna say something brilliant. But more than anything, what I want at the end of our time together for you to have 3 questions, 3 at least, that you're prompted to ask yourself based on what we discover together. These guiding questions will serve as a guidepost for you as you begin making new decisions. So as I've already mentioned, I have close to 20 years of experience knee deep in helping leaders make improvements to their organizations and to themselves. But we'd be here forever. I mean, we've already been here a good amount of time and I've learned so much about all the people that you've been helping. But I really categorize my work in two ways. This is the thread of my work: to uplift history and to uphold humanity. I found that if we're mindful of authentic, truthful history, then we have a better opportunity to see the humanity of people. And when we see the humanity of people, change has the potential to occur. These two areas are important because it spans across every industry and every culture. It impacts everyone. To amplify history, true history, you must be willing to interrogate what you understand of the world, particularly of the world that you are in. You must be willing to ask yourself some questions. One of them is, how do I know that's true? How do I know what I believe is true? It's a really hard question to ask yourself. But then you have to go further and ask, what if all that I've learned isn't true? That's a hard pill to swallow. I work with people all the time who have a difficult time asking that question because it then causes you to question everything in your world, your family and your family values, those you hang around, your education. Everything is into question, is called into question. Having an emphasis on history also requires us to look deeply at its interpreters and really begin to question who benefits from this series of information being shared. Those who benefit the most are likely to take their interpretation to market. Hello, grant professionals. Those who benefit the most, your organization, are usually the one to interpret and take it to market. And based on my research, and likely based on what you've learned in life, that sometimes leaves something out of the story. In this exploration, we must be willing to go beyond the surface, beyond what we can see, beyond what we can understand. This historic lens enables us to take notice that our perspectives are not the most important or valuable in the room. It allows us to see the past as an expression of what the present should be or could change. It allows us to experience people as authorities of their own lived experience. Humanity requires us to get into the depths of why people are valuable, their identities, their perspectives, their stories. I found that during the journey towards change, leaders make some discoveries about what is needed in order to grow outside of their comfort, particularly as they're thinking about how to be a better human. They begin to realize that we need a few things. We need empathy. I don't feel bad for you, I feel bad with you. We are in community, and when you hurt, I do too. That's empathy. And respect. I value your contribution to the world, even if it's different than my understanding of your world. And compassion. I believe that people are worthy of benefit of the doubt, and even in our doubt, they are a benefit. And inclusion. You should feel safe and welcome with me and know that you can be your most authentic self. These are just a few basic tenets of how to be a better human. I value both history and humanity because they both result in the shaping and sharing of powerful stories. So something you should know about me, if you haven't already gathered, I'm an educator by profession and personality. So of course, I have to take us back to the origin of how we learn stories. As I mentioned before, I facilitate a lot of workshops, and one of my most popular ones over the last maybe 5 years has been implicit biases and its connection to systemic oppression, particularly how your individual life is a part of a greater system designed to help some people remain minoritized and others in power. One of the first things we tackle in this workshop is about individual identity and how it's shaped. You learn a great deal about how the world works and how you fit into it between 0 and 5 years old. So if you have children anywhere in your atmosphere, anybody got children anywhere in your atmosphere, you don't have to have them, they don't have to be yours biologically, but you have nieces and nephews and neighbors and people, right? All of these folks, you're likely always saying like, wow, they are really smart. How did they learn that? Where did they get that from? Or like me, I'm always saying, where did he come from? It's usually what I'm asking about my son. But during this time, young people are hearing things like, don't touch this, don't run there, don't fall off that, go slower, hurry up. And also the dreaded share with your friend or your sibling or fill in the blank for whoever's right there with us. But even more than what a young person is being told, there are these implied actions or just the way it is moments. These are things that may be very confusing or contradictory and may vary in the reinforcement or punishment based on the environment. So this is where we insert grandparents. Like when my son goes to my parents' house, he can get away with anything. Total contradiction to me. At a very young age, your parents and other influences they allow in your space are what shape the narratives that you know. The very narratives that you still, sitting here today, use to make decisions. The same narratives you use to guide your children, coach your staff, and mentor young professionals. I mean, if you think about it, what is something that you've been sharing for a long time, but you have no clue what the origin of that sharing is? Can you think about anything like that? We pass these moments along to our children and other people we experience with the stern and exhaustive caveat, just do what I say. And when they ask you why 345 times, as all children do, what do you say? Because I said so. Because I said so. That's the way it is because I said so. That's how our world works. It is in those moments during identity development that are later reflected in how you interpret things, like the news. So particularly those biases that are learned allow you to see a headline. Think about any headline you've seen, or maybe a photo. And as soon as you read it, you have an immediate thought about the outcome of the person or the experience that they've had. Social media teaches us this behavior exists because if you're really smart or living under a rock, whichever you desire, and you aren't on social media, you wouldn't know this. But if you are, then you see it all the time, the droves of comments under the news section, and you can see the division. I was watching a movie on the way here, and one of the characters said something like, we fear what we don't understand. That's such a dangerous position to find yourself in, fearing someone because you see a flashing highlight of what was likely their worst day interpreted by someone else. What if I ask you to imagine the last headline you read, particularly the one that sparked some immediate thought in your brain? Was it written? Think about if it was written about you. Would that change the story for you? Or would that change the way you wanted others to approach the truth of the story? Stories are important because they impact generations. They either cement our placement in the world or invisibilize us like we never existed. They can shape the way we experience the world around us or cause us to uprise against the world within us. They can add a tricky emotion-filled layer to a conversation or push us to a stoic outcome. They can help us grapple with the reality while reminding us that other realities also exist. This is how powerful stories really are. As a matter of fact, if I took a moment and let you all share a story, and you actually heard some really great stories this morning, what happens is, and if I put you on a brain scan machine, your brain waves are nearly identical to the people who are listening to the story. Now, I say nearly identical because I'm not a Facebook scientist, so I don't want to be absolute. Okay. But nonetheless, that action between the two brains is called neural coupling. So when you say we're on the same wavelength, that actually is true. It's actually what's happening. So I actually want to see if we can get on the same wavelength with each other. This is tricky to do. I've done this before, but not with quite so many people in person and online. But let's see. I adapted this exercise from a colleague of mine, one of my favorite storytellers, Dave Hutchins. I want you to take out a pen and paper. So everybody take out pen and paper, some in the middle of your table. Get your pen and paper. And you're gonna write a 6-word story. 6-word story. The 6-word story should be about an aha moment you've had in your life. Now, let me tell you, what's so phenomenal about this experience is that I work with lots of folks in lots of spaces. It is usually those who are most educated and professional who have a challenge with this because it's a 6-word story, not 6 individual words. This happens all the time. Okay, so I want you to write down your 6-word story. After you've written your story, I want you to turn to your neighbor. Maybe even if I know that usually what we do is we all squeeze together people we know with people we know. But if it's someone you don't know, that'd be better. So turn to your neighbor and share your 6-word story. And then for about 30 or 45 more seconds, I'm going to time it. You can share more, you can elaborate, and then switch. And I'll yell switch so you'll know when we're switching. So I'm going to give you all about 2 to 3 minutes to do that. So write your story first, and then I'll let you, when you look at me, I'll know you're done writing your story. It's just like school, right? When you look up, I know you're done. Okay. Okay, I see faces looking up. Now you can talk to your neighbor. So take about 45 seconds to share your 6-word story and then share the story of that 6-word story. All right, switch with your neighbor. All right, let's bring it back. Bring it back, bring it back. Now I am a teacher in real life, so you got to bring it back. As they would say, if you can hear my voice, clap your hands. If you can hear my voice, yeah, clap your hands. All right, I've got you back. I've got you back. Thank you, online folks, for participating. Hopefully you could share your stories in the chat with each other and we can continue the conversation. If you're curious, my 6-word story is I am a recovering perfectionist. It's my 6-word story. So was that exercise fairly simple for you? You can, yeah, no, kinda. I definitely wanted to be over here in this story because it was full animation happening, and I really wanted to know more. As I looked around the room, I could read your body language. So yes, your body also speaks a language as well. It told me that you were engaged. I saw lots of head nods. I even saw hands doing this, which also lets me know like either you're really excited or you're mad, you know. And I imagine you're having a good time. So you're not mad. Everybody's interested. I saw eyebrow raises and interest. This gentleman here was like hitting the table, and that wasn't a bad thing. He was like excited, right? I was with him. It appeared that the conversation was happening pretty normal. You likely even found a dotted line back to your own connection with another person, right? Like something they said made you say, yes, I know that. So is that right? Like that's what you felt like? This is like Zoom. You can thumbs up or head nod. Like that's what was happening, right? Like we were having some points of relationship here. My observation though would be that this is a pretty homogenous group of folks. You're all here for the same thing. That means you could afford to be here. You likely have some similar jargon or understanding of language. You participate in similar communities, and you might even build your camaraderie around some type of similar challenge that you have. What you found was relatability. And relatability helps build relationship. But what happens when you can't find relatability and you don't softly land in a relationship? How does that impact your interest in another person's story? And how does that impact your ability to appreciate another person's story? You can sit with those questions. Again, write your questions for a moment. Another hat that I wear twice a week is adjunct instructor at Middle Tennessee State University. And so our institution offers some great professional development. And a few weeks ago, I had an opportunity to sit in a session about culture, which of course I love to talk about, I love to learn about. And they shared about going beyond the surface level culture and having a greater appreciation for shallow and deep culture. And so to give you some context, think of culture like a tree. At the top of the leaves, at the top of the tree is surface culture. Those are observable patterns like food, music, and art. The tree itself, so think about the tree stump, is shallow culture or unspoken rules, attitudes, concepts of time, and nonverbal communications. And the roots of the tree under the ground is deep culture, collective beliefs and norms, which shapes your worldview, your concepts of who you are, and decision making. So I was excited to take those notes back to my class the following week because we were doing a lesson on developing content. In particular, for this class, it's about developing content for social and digital media. And much like what I know about many of you, I'm convinced that my students are perfectly capable of developing content, or in your case, grants, that are perfectly acceptable to many. However, I want to take a step back and investigate what it means to go beyond the surface. In particular, what it means to explore our understanding of acceptable and familiar culture. I want you to think to yourself about an experience maybe that you've had that was maybe shocking to you because it was outside of what you considered acceptable or familiar practices. Or to use a term we just talked about, relatable. It was outside of what was relatable for you. And then think about who sets the rules for what's acceptable. Maybe this goes back to our discussion about identity. And it's one of those just the way it is conversations and experiences, or has something else conditioned us to only see what we understand is acceptable? Either of those answers results in a one-sided perspective. So to help my students understand more about how to sharpen their cultural intelligence, I shared this really wonderful TEDx talk by Pellegrino Riccardi. You get a chance, look it up. It's really good. It's titled Cross-Cultural Communication. He's Italian and British and lives in Norway. So his life experiences living across countries with differing customs helps him guide people to look within themselves, rather, to see the value of other cultural experiences. He outlines this idea about our perception of what is accepted and familiar leaves us unable to connect with other people. In the video, he shares this story, which I think is kind of cool for you all to think about. And he was eating a meal next to a thin gentleman. And Pellegrino's accepted cultural practices to have, as an Italian man, is to have deep and colorful conversation while eating, using his hands. He asked a very softball question to the gentleman beside him, hoping to get something relatable to respond to. And he was met with a two-word response. I asked my students to visualize that moment and what assumption they made about the gentleman from Finland. My students' responses varied, but they could be themed as cold behavior or dismissive. But how do we know that's true? Did we make that decision off of a single story, a single moment? Or did we have some historic perspective that colored the experience differently? What makes us take one moment and create an entire narrative? The reality is that his response in that situation was perfectly normal for him. So it leads me to wonder why we have a need to feel comfortable, even at the sacrifice of someone else's comfort. So back to my students, as I was having them to reflect on their own experiences in these uncomfortable situations, I shared my own reflective experiences. So I have a couple of quick stories. I shared an example where I was asked several years ago to attend a Somali mosque to present on our city's general planning process. So every city plans out how the city is going to grow over the next 25 or 30 years. I was told there would be women and men, and we would have these concurrent sessions happening at the same time, of course. But when I arrived, the women were not there. It was only men. It was leading into some holiday, I don't recall which one. And so the women were at home in preparation of that. So my male colleague was walking up to one of the gentlemen, one of the leaders in the room, and I followed behind him to hear some instructions. As I was introduced and about to be my most Southern self and extend my hand, I remembered where I was. I took a couple of micro steps back with the intention to no longer be shoulder to shoulder with my male colleague, but slightly behind, just because he needed to lead the conversation. And throughout the meeting, I listened and I took notes and I responded to answer a question that was directed to me. The point I wanted my students to get, and the point I want you all to get, is that while it's acceptable and favored to be cordial and respectful, it was important for me to adapt to how that was to be interpreted in that environment. And although we have different practices, that didn't change my desire to be in community with them. I just need to understand the rules and adjust to the different set of customs. I went on to share another story of another colleague who from time to time we would do these large scale projects. She owned a company at the time that worked in Hispanic marketing. And our relationship really cemented my comprehension of transcultural language and experiences. The campaign we were working on was about picking, so selecting your favorite transit option. So the graphics that the designers were using were of children picking different things, like picking a guitar, picking flowers, and picking their nose. So they were using these really cute graphics. It was very kitschy, it was very tongue-in-cheek. But one thing that was very clear in conversation with my colleague was that although it was really cute, it was not going to translate well with the community that she worked with. Not because the literal words didn't translate, because they do, or that people who speak Spanish aren't familiar with picking flowers or picking their nose, but it was just very specific type of Southern humor. And that was just not going to culturally translate the way that it was intended to be received. So we adapted. And guess what happens? Every time, because this is not the first experience, it won't be the last experience, where something doesn't translate. When we do the right thing by the community, by not presenting them things that don't honor our understanding of them, we build a greater relationship, even if we're not always sure how to be relatable. I have so many stories about this, and it's important that I've studied and listened and celebrated others' deep culture to understand the world around me. These are just two examples of what it means to understand stories beyond just the words, and why it's necessary to get to greater context, to get to the heart of people, to get to the soul of the story and the storyteller. You must be willing to adapt. I'd even go further and say that these examples are what happens when you follow the needs of the people and the integrity of the story versus our own needs, our own biases, and our own looming deadlines. This is what happens when we go from centering the ego that we have in the outcome to the one that holds space for the story to evolve as people need it to. So now let's bring it all full circle. I've reminded you of how stories are shaped in your life. We've even written a story, found our relatable points. We've discussed how to consider deep culture as an opportunity to adapt and build relationships. Now, how do we live all of this out? We start, as we started this conversation in the beginning, I said, you need thoughtful questions. So how many of you have your 3 questions? Oh, okay, a few of you. It's important to get your 3 questions. They will help you, I promise. But it's okay if you don't have them, you'll still get them. The questioning starts with your own self. So I want you to take a deep breath and consider this question, because it's a question I often ask when I work in communities like yours. Based on the stories I share within my work, so this is your question to yourself, based on the stories I share within my work, am I contributing to the help or the harm of those we serve? So I'm Southern, right? So I heard them, that's like, ooh, okay, yeah, we're moving in the right direction. That's a difficult question. As grant writers, grant managers, grant administrators, and all the other important positions in between, it is our goal to get the funds, to manage the funds, and report on the funds. And yes, I understand there's way more than that. Just to be clear, I sit in your position. I serve as director of innovation for an organization, a grassroots organization. And of course, that title means I find ways to innovate, and then I got to pay for it. So I sit in that position. I also work with one of our city government departments administering the VOCA federal grant. I sit in your position. So I know it's a lot of work. And because I sit in those positions, I've experienced all types of people. And sometimes we forget why the grant exists. Why does the grant exist? It is to serve the community, the people that you wrote the grant for, not just the funder, just to be clear. But how are you caring for the people when you share their story? How do you care for them? I've read a lot of grants. I have sat on many grant panels, and I often wonder if the community that the grant was written for, if they read the grant application, what would be their emotional experience? How would they see themselves through your stories of them? You see, we treat those we serve in our organizations like they are just a grant, but they are really people with complex, unique needs. The grant process sometimes pushes us further away from the relatability of another person, from the humanity of another person. But I'm not going to get on a soapbox about it, though I could talk about it for hours, because I do all the time. My only point here is to get you to question your approach in the humanity of the stories that you tell. So next, I want you to consider if you're the right narrator for the story. I remember it was several years ago, and we had a client, and when we went to the meeting and we left, I remember turning to my team member and I said, this is a situation where we have the right story and the absolute wrong narrator for it. The story was great, but the person managing the stories could not connect with the audience. They couldn't connect. And you're also in this precarious situation, I realize that, where the story needs to be told in a way that reflects the mission of the organization, but also the needs of the funder. I get the dynamic there. But I want you to continue to question, are you the right person to be sharing the story? As an example, I saw lots of you stand up. Everybody should have stand up really when Jonna was talking, because all of the great work you've been doing, particularly in the middle of a pandemic. But I question, because I'm a questioner now, How many of the stories, how many stories do you share of Black and brown people where your staff or your volunteer community is the savior in the story? Do people need to be saved? Or do they need to lead their own saving and you support that? It's a tricky line, right? But it's an important distinction to make. The same thing happens with people with disabilities. They're so resilient. They're so inspiring. It's called inspiration porn when we do that. Ooh, yeah, it's a grown-up conversation. You can look it up. It's a real thing, right? People are resilient, but should they have to be? If the conditions change, we change the conditions, the people will thrive. Okay. Just want you to be questioning. This is why having people who are experts at their own lived experience as a part of your grant team is something I'm advocating for. You hire people like me, polished professionals, consultants, communicators. The people whose stories you're telling are also polished, professional communicators about their lived experience. They should be a part of that. This is why I encourage mission moments with the organizations that I work with. This is why I encourage audio and video conversations with them so we can preserve and memorialize, because remember what I said about history. It has the ability to cement us or invisibilize us. And I'll even go further and say again, they should be paid if they're sharing their story with you. Next, this is the third point if you're taking notes. I want you to listen for more than a single story. I often say there is your truth, my truth, and the truth, and all of those truths have to exist in one space. I want you to find ways to experience other people and their truths. I'll go back to social media. It's a really great place for you to do that. You can get a more expansive understanding of the world by people that you follow. Follow pages and people who go beyond your spaces of comfort and get you outside of your own echo chamber. What I love, I'll give you an example. What I love about something like Instagram is that when I go and find Indigenous communities to listen to, then they have this little area right up under when I say follow that says, these are other people you want to follow. Okay, I don't know them. I want to know more. So it's very simple. It's not very difficult. So as we're nearing this 2 years in this global pandemic, and I'm sure you all are feeling that, I've really been reflecting on what is going to be said about this time, because it has the potential to be one single story. What will our kids remember, or those who are not even born yet? Remember Y2K? I was thinking about that as I was like, oh my gosh, what do we remember about that? It was like mass hysteria, and then nothing happened. But how do you share that to the world, right? I could just say it was mayhem, it was crazy, but really it wasn't. It wasn't that terrible, right? But maybe it was for some people, and so we have to honor that. So what will you remember? What stories will you repeat? Which ones will you choose to forget? And which ones will you revise? What stories will you repeat? Which will you forget? Which will you revise? Just in the last week, I've been drawn to a couple of stories for various reasons. One is about Gabby Petito, which has been in the news for quite some time now, but I love 2020, so I watch this segment about her. And there are so many reasons why this saddens me. Because one, at a very basic level, I'm a woman and I was a young woman and I had this glistening look in my eyes too, the way that she did. And I could have been Gabby. I mean, any woman or even young man in this room could have been Gabby. And on an even greater level, I'm a parent and I'm grieved that she didn't go home to her parents. It also saddens me because it places this glaring spotlight on the missing and murdered Indigenous and Black women in the same exact area that didn't receive any media attention. As a matter of fact, as I was watching this 2020 special about Gabby Petito, it was shared that in the past decade, only 18% of Indigenous women have gotten any media attention. What will we remember about this time? What will you share? I'm also grieved about what's happening at the trial of murderer Kyle Rittenhouse. I am grieved that the judge says that he may allow those who were murdered to be called looters and rioters and not victims, because who's on trial? What will we remember? And there are thousands of those type of stories on your timeline. Are you willing to go beyond the single headline, the single narrative, the single storyteller, and see more? I'm getting to a close. In the South, they say like a Baptist pastor, you close 3 times. So give me a second, okay? And then the fourth thing, I have 5 things we work on. 4th thing, seek relationship even if you can't find immediate relatability. So another quick story. I lead several sessions on diversity, equity, inclusion in the nonprofit board recruitment. And in that workshop, a very common question that I receive often is about how do we get more racial diversity on our board? I hear the anxiety and the pressure to just get it right. I hear that. But the strategies miss the mark because there's a process for recruitment, but not a process for relationship. Instead, it usually goes something like this. And if you agree, if you recognize this, you can nod your head. Okay. At some point throughout the year, the board membership or nominating committee comes to everybody and says, we need a slate of candidates. They pull the slate of candidates together. Maybe they have a meeting, a coffee date with that person, maybe not. And they send them before the board, they get approval, they vote. Okay. This happens over a very short amount of time. But this plan is really rigid. It doesn't consider that people may need longer in the relationship. They may need to understand the organization or the mission better. There's an assumption that this is something that diverse candidates should just be jumping at this opportunity to serve. But what happens when they don't immediately respond or immediately accept the position? The narrative is, well, we just can't find anyone, which we know isn't true. And this mostly happens because the environment that is being created requires a person to follow this timeline. And when they don't, or because they can't, they are seen as unacceptable. Remember, single story perspective. So back to this session I teach, I ask nonprofit leaders how they go about recruiting donors. The difference is startling. Everyone seems to understand that it takes months, maybe even years, to cultivate and build these amazing relationships with the local funder. They have to build trust. They want to connect back to their personal mission in some way. And the person or the foundation they're seeking a relationship with is honored and lauded for their philanthropic contributions, and they're seen as valuable. But why isn't diversity on the board met with the same value? People's time is valuable too. There's a lot that can be said in the differences in recruiting diverse candidates and building relationships with wealthy donors, but the key distinction takes us back to the beginning of our conversation. This approach lacks humanity. And especially if you understand what it feels like to be tokenized, or you understand what it means to be historically harmed at the hands of charity, then you'd have a different outlook about your approach. But that's a long way around me saying, I want you to find ways to invest in relationships that are centered in the humanity, even if you can't find the immediate relatability of another person. So here's a quick recap. Ask questions. Consider that you are not the right narrator. Listen for more than a single story and seek relationships. But there's one more I want to close on. At the beginning of our conversation, I shared that humanity requires us to see people. It requires us to get into the depths of why people are valuable, their identity, their cultures, and their stories. We discussed empathy, respect, compassion, and inclusion. But there's another tenet that will support your journey to telling better stories, and more importantly, lead you to being a better human. It's curiosity. I'm willing to question what I know, because there may be another way that I'm unaware of. And when I do this, I provide grace and kindness people need, curiosity. Remain curious, uplift history, and uphold humanity to tell better stories. Thank y'all so much.